Hi, I'm Bernard Leong, and you may know me as the guy who's part of an executive leadership team to get Alibaba Group to invest in Singapore Post from my past life. And in my spare time, I want to understand why Jack Ma decided to retire from the Alibaba Group and what does it mean for them in the future. You are listening to Analyse Asia, the weekly podcast dedicated to business, technology, and media in Asia. And today I have Rui Ma, founder of Transformative Technology Academy and host of the TechBuzz China podcast here again. Welcome, Rui Ma, and it's great to have you back.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Yes, since our last conversation, what have you been up to?
Yeah, so as you introduced, I've been really busy working on the TechBuzz China podcast, really excited at how that's going. More and more people are interested in China tech, so that's very encouraging. And as for my, Transformative Technology Academy, which is an online incubator for startups in technology working on well-being and mental health, that's been going really well. We have over 1,000 people in our community representing 69 countries. So really exciting. And I think we definitely have some from Singapore. I have to look, but yeah, we definitely have some.
So you've actually started working with all these startups in the wellness space at the moment?
Yeah. Basically, it's an online incubator for startups and aspiring entrepreneurs, mostly in the pre-seed and seed stage.
Before I get onto the main subject of the day, I wanted to just tap your brain a bit on some topics in China, which I actually listened to the TechBuzz China podcast, and I thought those episodes were pretty interesting. So the first one I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on Baidu versus Google Part 2, if it's ever happening, thanks to, of course, Land Grant Ward's breaking of the Project Dragonfly in The Intercept recently?
Yeah, that's a really interesting ongoing saga. It seems that, I saw news yesterday as well coming out that Google might be going ahead with the program despite sort of internal employee disapproval. For us, we covered more to the Chinese perspective and why Chinese people would be interested in having Google re-enter China. And as you mentioned, we did do a whole episode on it. A lot of it centered around how in China, most specifically with Baidu, because they do have 70% market share, but actually all the search players have sort of opaque business practices that are not always consumer friendly. So a lot of the what I would call quote unquote tech elites in China are really looking forward to having Google re-enter the market because they think it'll bring more transparency to the market. But it's important to note that even the people who are really big fans of Google don't think they'll succeed. So don't think they'll really make a dent in market share in China. And if you look at, what they did before they left, honestly, they had like second place, but they weren't gaining on Baidu. So it's hard to see them really winning in China. But like I said, from the Chinese perspective, quite a few people do want them to return.
I understand that Google has recently invested in JD, Jingdong, and of course, Google is also talking to Tencent. Could there actually be a scenario where they will just enter China but through Tencent this time around so that they only need to embed their technologies to take on Baidu without actually going into a direct fight?
Yeah, again, we actually did an episode as well on JD and Google tie-up. Or I shouldn't call it tie-up because it was a very small investment. I don't really see that being politically less sensitive than Google entering, on its own, quote unquote. So I'm not sure how to assess that situation. I think right now, a lot of the risks are really, it's less commercial and it's more political.
I'll put the links to both episodes, but I want to ask you one more question before we get onto it. I wanted to ask, is WeChat really bulletproof?
Awesome, Bernard. You're such a great promoter of our episodes. Yeah, so you're referring to basically this new chat app called Bullet Messenger that came out, I guess, a few weeks, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, and really shot up to the top of the app stores in China. And, a lot of headlines proclaimed that it was going after WeChat. In fact, if you look at the app and if you, read the interviews of the founder, it's really going after more like Slack, right? So more of a workplace or what they call productivity chatting. Our assessment is basically no, right? It's a very still unpolished product. And a lot of the momentum behind it was actually because they had a celebrity entrepreneur, this guy named Luo Yonghao, endorse it. And that was a lot of the reason behind the quick ramp up. And that's already you can already see that it's tapered down quite a bit because the app, I've used it not significantly because I don't have too many friends on it. You just can't really see what the true innovations are. I don't really think that it does what it claims to, which is workplace communications, as far as I know right now. Of course, they've already raised $22 million, so we'll see. Maybe they have some significant product changes coming up that could be interesting. But as of right now, myself and most other people I know looking at tech in China are not bullish. And so, yes, WeChat would be bulletproof.
Of course, this is interesting because you mentioned Slack. I also remember that Alibaba, which is also going to be the main subject of this day, has a product that's quite similar called Ding Ding. And I remember when I was working with them from the Singapore Post site, they were heavily recommending that app for my company to actually try to use them.
Yeah, the English name is Ding Talk. And indeed, in Alibaba, of course, internally, you have to use that product. There is also quite a few businesses who use it. And by the way, WeChat also has an enterprise version. Unfortunately, both of these apps require sort of a business license, like a physical registration of a business in China to use. So I personally have not used it. I've seen screenshots of the products. But as far as I know, I think that there is probably still a little bit of room for someone to come up with a workplace messenger. It does seem like there are complaints online about, Ding Talk and WeChat Enterprise. I don't know. My personal opinion is, I use Slack all the time and I see a lot of improvements that could be, made on Slack too. So I don't know that there's a perfect solution because everyone works so differently.
I mean, Slack has not been banned in China, right? If I didn't remember wrongly.
Oh, I think it has actually. Or it's, actually we should check, but I think it has because we have people in our program from China using Slack and I know that they have trouble connecting. I believe it has.
So this is probably one of the most interesting conversation, which I got you here because I want to hear your thoughts on Alibaba's leadership transition. I'm just going to start off by talking a little bit about Alibaba Group. Today is actually a multinational conglomerate specializing in e-commerce, retail, AI, cloud computing, and finance with Ant Financial at over US 400 billion market capitalization since the founding in 1999 by Jack Ma, along with another 17 founders. And of course, we called this 18 founders the 18 Luohan, the 18 monks gods in the Buddhist world. And to help my audience, maybe can you introduce Alibaba Group as a company and how they are perceived in China and the rest of the world?
Yeah, sure. I can give like a really brief overview. So Alibaba is, the top 1 or 2 internet companies in China, right? They kind of trade spots with Tencent. They were both at one point over $500 billion in market cap, and I think both have come down a little bit since then. Alibaba is more known for sort of e-commerce, but like you said, it's really expanded into a lot of other industries. So it's really the 800-pound gorilla in commerce. So it has, as of Q2 2018, their financial reports show that they have 576 million active users online for their e-commerce products. So that's a lot. That's over 500 million people. And they have 634 million mobile MAU. The main products they have under e-commerce are Taobao, which most people probably have heard of, Tmall, which we can talk about a little bit later, which is more for, larger brands. And then, of course, they have a stakes through Ant Financial in Alipay, AliExpress, and then there's also their old business, Alibaba.com, which was like the first company under the umbrella to go public. And then their new efforts include AliYun, which is Ali Cloud, their Ali Cloud business, Cainiao, which is their logistics business. They have AutoNavi, mapping. They have Yueba, which is sort of an asset management, money management app. And then recently they have a lot in the news on Hema, which is their retail 2.0, this upgraded sort of supermarket with a lot of, you can think of like a lot more intelligent grocery store. They also have significant stakes in other companies or have outright acquired companies that were previously independent, but they've acquired them, such as Weibo. They have a stake in Weibo. They've acquired Youku Tudou, which was China's leading online video platform. They have a stake in Singapore Post, which you mentioned that you had worked at before. And UC Web was one of their biggest acquisitions. That's a web browser. And then, recently, I think in the news a lot, you've seen an Alibaba invested company called Ele.me, which is food delivery, of course, in Southeast Asia. So they bought Lazada out right? But if you look at the company, the listed entity, it's still growing really quickly. In Q2, they had revenue growth of 61% year on year. That's huge. I mean, we're talking about a really large business here with annual revenues of $40+ billion. They're also still highly profitable. They have $4 billion of adjusted free cash flow. Last quarter, they had $12 billion of revenue. So that's sort of 43% margin. Really, really impressive.
And of course, Alibaba Group has actually extended all itself across the world globally, and particularly it's been actually going to be competing Tencent and Jingdong Direct in the Southeast Asia market. And this has actually been one of the biggest focal points of why people in China are now interested into Southeast Asia. One thing I wanted to know is probably, we all hear of Jack Ma. We know how influential he is with Alibaba, as probably he is the co-founder, even though there are 70 other founders, but he's actually very influential. So I think maybe we should take a step back and to hear about what's Jack Ma's role in Alibaba and how has he shaped Alibaba's dominance in e-commerce in so many areas over the years then?
Yeah, I mean, you can think of Jack Ma as sort of the spiritual leader. Honestly, he hasn't been involved in operations on a day-to-day basis for a very long time, right? So he is, like you said, even though there are 18 quote-unquote co-founders, he's really the face of Alibaba, and he's really the person who has been the main spokesperson. He's also been credited with like all of the sort of strategy that set Alibaba up for the first, 10, 15 years. He's really taken a step back in the past couple years, I think, like I said, from the day-to-day operations, but most people still identify Alibaba very much as Jack Ma's company. So I would say he's the spiritual leader and he's the main cheerleader of the company. I think it's important to talk about his impact on Alibaba from a personality and cultural perspective. So Jack Ma, I don't know if your listeners know, but really started off as an English teacher, right? So he went to teaching school and then he was very good at English. He was rated like top 10 teacher in Hangzhou, which is a big city in China. After he graduated and was working, he started a translation service, which is, he always refers to it as his first attempt at entrepreneurship and sort of failed miserably. And then he, was able to stumble upon Alibaba as an idea. But the important thing here to know is that he has never been a technical person. So in fact, he sort of prides himself on it. And he says that Alibaba really benefited from this side of him because he is able to sort of not get tangled up in the technical side of things and really sort of see through to the consumer's need. I would say generally in China, he really has a cult following. If you just walk around in China in the airports, a lot of times they have videos of, famous business people talking sort of like Tony Robbins style, self-help gurus and all that. A lot of times you'll see Jack Ma's face because he's really known for what we call 心灵鸡汤, which is like chicken soup, which is like self-help, a lot of, encouragement, a lot of like, you can do it attitude. So people just absolutely love this guy. And they also like love him because he's able to succeed in spite of all his, I guess, sort of disadvantages, right? So number one, he didn't come from like some important family or anything like that. And Hangzhou, relatively speaking, is a second tier city in China. But also he is, in Chinese, like he's ugly. So, and he says that himself, he's not a good looking guy. And this is not a politically incorrect thing to say because in China, looks actually matter a lot. And, a lot of people, I think less so now because he's so successful and he is the richest man in China. But for a very long time, people were like, oh my God, Jack Ma looks like an alien. If he can succeed, so can I, So he has that sort of effect on people. Very, very motivating. He's like a big motivational speaker. Yeah. And like I said, because of his non-technical background in Alibaba when he set it up, you can see in Alibaba's culture, it's less dominated by technical staff, right? So in a lot of Silicon Valley companies, if you talk to the employees there, they feel that, for example, like technical staff are valued much more than other staff. But in Alibaba, that's not the case. And in fact, you have this weird phenomenon where, they say publicly, actually, and if you go online and look for it, Alibaba's HR is like one of the most powerful departments. Because like I said, of Jack Ma's sort of unconventional background that led him to this, tech startup business. So he manages things, I think, quite differently from what you might think of other people, especially his, other people that are mentioned in the same breath as him, right? Like Robin Li and Pony Ma, who are both technical and engineers by origin. So he's just very different.
One interesting thing I want to point out here is that if we want to get to understand a little bit about Jack Ma's early days, Porter Erasmus's movie, The Crocodile of Yangtze, is a very, very good movie that actually shows how Jack Ma thought about Alibaba from the start, because it takes a lot of clips of their early days and also putting together how Jack Ma fought eBay and basically crushed them with Taobao in the end, and the way how he got it done in that way. I mean, I don't know whether you have watched that movie, and it kind of gave me a feel of actually Alibaba is not very typical as a Chinese company. It feels more like a Silicon Valley company, even when I visited them in Hangzhou as well.
Yeah. I have quite a few friends who work for Alibaba, and I do think it's different from some of the other Chinese tech companies. Actually, BAT are all quite different in their own right. But yeah, like Jack Ma is really known for being very creative. And I think that has a lot to do with his non-technical, more liberal arts. Although he was an English teacher, I'm not quite sure that's liberal arts, maybe like just general humanities background.
I also need to point out one interesting thing about Hangzhou. And if for the audience do not know, there is this very good Chinese saying, 上有天堂,下有苏杭, and they refer to Hangzhou. Hangzhou is also a very interesting place where most of the most well-known Chinese poets came from, and probably most well-known is Su Dongpo, and some of the great intellectuals of China actually came from Hangzhou. And I think Cainiao is currently somewhere in the third and the fourth, where the largest group of entrepreneurs are actually building unicorns. So it's a pretty interesting place, even for a second-tier city, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Well, it's part of Zhejiang, which is known as where in the old days, I think a lot of strategists came from and business people. So very commercially minded place in terms of heritage.
Why has he decided to retire, given that he's only 54 years old now? I mean, compare and contrast to Pony Ma from Tencent and Robin Li from Baidu.
Yeah, I mean, we can only go by, I don't know exactly what's going on inside his brain, so we can only go by what he said publicly. But I think actually he's been fairly consistent, and this is not a total surprise, right? I mean, the guy really does love teaching. Like I said, he, was a top teacher before he started Alibaba, and he's been very consistent about that. So basically, teaching is a very revered profession in China. Like, you get a lot of respect for being a teacher. If you go online and read what Alibaba employees have said about Jack, basically inside the company, you don't call him Ma Zong, which would be meaning, boss Ma, would be a typical title for a boss. You have to call him Ma Lao Shi, right? Which means teacher Ma. He's really held on to that identity. He also started Hupan University, which I think you can loosely translate as Lakeside University, a couple years ago, really focused on educating entrepreneurs. He's been very consistent in his love for education. And in fact, when he announced his retirement officially, it was on September 10th. It did happen to be his birthday, apparently, but in Chinese media, you see that he chose this day because it's Teacher's Day. So again, this guy has just been very consistent about his love for education, which is one of the main reasons he cited as why he wanted to retire. So if you do go by that story or that narrative, I think there's a lot of evidence, it's been building up for the past decade or so. Again, if you look at what he's actually done with the role, he's given up the CEO role a few years back, 3 years ago, to Daniel Zhang, who he's named officially now as the successor. It's not like a surprise. It's not like he's giving everything up on the same day. He's slowly graduated, slowly and gradually given away responsibility. So this is just the next step. If you do compare him to his peers, as you said, Robin Li and Pony Ma, I think those people are just very different personality. There's this joke in Chinese internet that if, one of the BAT CEOs goes missing, if it happens to be Jack, the stock will probably go down. If it's Pony, probably nothing will happen to the stock. If it's Robin of Baidu, then the stock will probably go up. Sad for Robin. But, even if you look at Pony actually chose the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. His company did go public, early 2000s, not recently. He chose this Hong Kong Stock Exchange because it didn't have dual class structures, because he wanted to be very egalitarian. And to this day, he doesn't have extra voting rights more than his economic interest. In fact, I think his voting rights are now like less than 10%. He's steadily decreased it. And, I think if you compare Alibaba to Tencent, it's not that different, like in the sense that Pony has also really, over the years, given up more and more control and built a more and more sort of complete team. The difference is that Pony still retains his title as CEO and chairman, whereas Jack has, actively given up the CEO title a few years back and will be abdicating, officially his chairman title next year. But I think if you look at what they're actually doing, they have built sort of plan for succession. I think of the companies you said, the only real company that doesn't seem like it has such a plan is Robin. And Baidu is just notorious for churning through executives. They're, Lu Qi, their COO, left recently after just a year and a half. And I think that's sort of more what maybe people associate with Chinese company with no plan for succession. But if you look at Tencent and Alibaba, I think they've actually done both a good job. So I'm not sure that it's fair to say Jack is the only person who's thinking about this actively.
That's probably true, because I think for Pony Ma in Tencent, he actually differs a lot of the public to Martin Lau, the president of Tencent, in terms of the messaging of the company and where the company is actually going. And he's actually been very, very reclusive from the back to try to figure out the strategy for Tencent. I always like to make this analogy that the BAT is very reminiscent of the Three Kingdoms. And Robin Li is just the perfect 蜀国, where you have a lot of 5-star generals, but they didn't become the winner, and they're basically constantly clobbered by the other two. And I just divided between who should be Sun Quan and who should be Cao Cao. And I always think that, Jack Ma is more like Cao Cao and Pony Ma is more like Sun Quan.
That's hilarious. Yeah. Like I said, I think it has a lot to do with the personalities of the companies, right? Of the company founders. Yeah, Pony, like you said, is just, he self-identifies highly as a, engineer, as a nerd, whereas Jack has always been like, I'm a teacher, right? I'm a public speaker. I'm, a guru. And that's why he's much, much more visible. I mean, it also helps a lot that his English is fantastic. So that's why we see a lot more of him in the Western press as well.
I think that comes to the famous memo then. Jack Ma wrote the memo to announce his departure. And my favorite line is the part where he said, "The one thing I can promise everyone is Alibaba was never about Jack Ma, but Jack Ma will forever belong to Alibaba." I mean, that's a great line. I'm pretty sure that a lot of executives will use that at some point. What are your thoughts on the memo as a whole?
I read it. I think it's pretty sentimental. It's very, especially the line you just cited, it's very Jack. So I'm not surprised. I read the Chinese as well as the English version. I think that basically it was pretty much expected he would write something like that. And by the way, Chinese CEOs often write these sort of memos that sometimes are public, sometimes are to their employees, but, are, I think, intentionally leaked to the press. But there is a lot of, people use a lot of like sort of sentimental language. It's completely normal. I think probably Jack Ma's letter got so much attention because of the high profile nature of Alibaba. But like if you read like Lei Jun's stuff to his, employees, it's very much the same, right? It's very like full of camaraderie, full of like motivational chicken soup. And then even if you read like the recent Chinese companies prospectuses, they come with like, let's say, a chairman's letter. I can think of two that I recently read, like Pinduoduo and Neo. Yeah, like they're full of like idealism and stuff. It almost doesn't feel like it belongs in an IPO prospectus. But again, that's very much the Chinese way. Yeah, like I really suggest your listeners read them if you want to get a better sense of how Chinese CEOs communicate, because that is the way they communicate.
I like the point that you made about that in Chinese is actually also pretty interesting read as well, because Chinese is a very metaphorical language, and actually a lot of the essence of how Jack presented his departure in Chinese was far more interesting. So for those who understands Chinese as we do, you should probably go and read the memo of all these people.
Yeah, seriously, yeah.
So I guess the past is past, and of course we look to the future then. Who is Daniel Zhang, the successor to his chairmanship next year at this time?
Yeah, well, at this point, I think Daniel is compared to Jack, right? So they're positioned in media. And again, I don't know either of them personally, but I can just tell you sort of like how the media positions them. And this could be Alibaba PR, or it could be actually true, but they're sort of like yin and yang. They're very complementary. So you have Jack, who's this sort of straight talking, very motivational, like very sort of loud guru type teacher, right? And then you have Daniel, who's very much sort of heads down, works hard, doesn't, supposedly he works really hard, doesn't have a very much like of a social life, and sort of sticks around like Alibaba industrial park most of the time. If you look at his background, he used to be the CFO of Shanda, which was a publicly listed gaming company and one of the earlier companies in China to go public. And actually, Shanda at the time was like a $3 billion company. So one of the reasons he joined Alibaba was he said, "Oh, I'm CFO of a $3 billion company. I wonder if I can successfully be a CFO of a $30 billion company." And, he joined Alibaba like over 10 years ago. And now lo and behold, he's not just a CFO, he's the CEO of a, $400 billion company. So he's really, really grown along with Alibaba. If I had to use this is not a really good, or this is not a perfect metaphor, but you can think of Jack as more like Steve Jobs, sort of like very visionary, very out there, really great marketer. And Daniel is more like Tim Cook, right? Really just executes well. Doesn't have too much of a temper, is much more low key. In fact, even though he's been CEO of Alibaba for so long, he's just so little in the press that he was announced, when the retirement was announced, that some articles were like, who is Zhang Yong, right? His Chinese name. Who is Daniel Zhang? Here are things you need to know about him because you might not have heard of him before. So even though he's been at Alibaba for over a decade, he just doesn't have the public presence or persona that Jack does. However, if you look at his achievements, at least as Jack has laid them out, they're very significant. So first of all, he created Tmall, and Tmall is a very significant part of Alibaba's business. Like I said, they're the marketplace where larger brands sell, right? Because Taobao is more C2C and Tmall is really B2C. That's considered his entrepreneurship, or actually intrapreneurship experience. And I'm sure that's behind a lot of the reason why he is now the main guy in terms of Alibaba. He also created the Singles Day, the November 11th Singles Day, which is the equivalent of, China's Black Friday. So he created that and he gets credit for it. And again, that's almost one of the most important days to Alibaba at this point, right? So also, when he took over as CEO, Alibaba had just gone public, and that Alibaba had barely $200 billion market cap, and he's more than doubled that in the last 3 years. Of course, you can argue that, maybe if someone else was in his position, Alibaba would still be doing well, but the main thing that he's credited with is that he's really turned Alibaba from just a sort of e-commerce company to a much more, like we said in the beginning, a much more complete platform. So, people in China credit him with saying he's turned Alibaba from something that was more just commercial to now a real tech company. And some of the initiatives include, of course, there's Ant Financial and Cainiao, but specifically Ali Cloud, which, by the way, Alibaba loves to highlight, and it grew 93% last quarter. So it's a very fast growing business and very important to Alibaba. And a lot of the strategies behind going towards the more technical parts, more data driven parts of businesses are, at least externally from what I can see, they're attributed or credited to Daniel.
So I guess what would be the key area of focus which are which Alibaba Group are actually heading in the next decade? I mean, I look at the three components of it, and I think that maybe you have some thoughts on each one of them. So maybe I'll start off first by going to the external out of China. Let's start with international expansion. Where do you think they will be heading then?
Well, I know they just set up an important JV in Russia, right? So I think for most of the Chinese companies that I can see, they are going primarily into neighboring regions, right? Because expanding into the West, it's just far and it's very expensive as well. Whereas you have sort of lower hanging fruit in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and then of course all along the One Belt, One Road program, which you definitely want to support if you're a leading Chinese company, because that is President Xi's sort of like lasting, like he's basically made it his legacy, right? One Belt, One Road. So there's a lot of countries along there that you want to participate in. So I think as far as I can see, like maybe 5 years ago, a lot of Chinese tech companies were really eager to come here in Silicon Valley and establish a big presence here, but that's slowed down somewhat. And they've, from what I can see, been a lot more serious about where you're at, Singapore, Southeast Asia, India in particular. And like I said earlier, the OBOR, One Belt, One Road countries.
How about Ant Financial and Cainiao? Because they are also going to go IPO and be individual companies that are of significant weight to Alibaba Group as a whole.
Yeah. So if you look at, so we actually did an episode on Ant Financial a couple weeks ago. So I think for Ant Financial, it's not a near term IPO. Like it's not in the next 1 or 2 years. It seems they've said that it'll be, a few years down the road. There are some challenges for the business because fintech is just heavily regulated in China. And you've already seen people coming in and taking some of the best ideas and replicating them. For example, Yuobao, right? So that business has completely changed in the past 5 years. If you look at Ant Financial's own sort of projections, they've also changed a lot from sort of a consumer finance, purely consumer finance, now to they're projecting that most of their revenues in a few years will actually be from enterprise sales. So they'll be more of a technical solutions provider versus what many people might know them as now, which is like Alipay and purely consumer. And a lot of that really has to do with just sort of changing regulations and changing assessment of risk, credit, et cetera, in China. So we'll see. Obviously, it's worth like $150 billion or something like that at this point. So it's a huge company and everyone's anticipating its IPO. But I actually think compared to the Alibaba's sort of like core business, it probably will change a lot more than we think.
And Cainiao, you think is also going to be in the next few years, because I think they're still in the building stage of the logistics for just within China itself.
Yeah, Cainiao already does something like, I think it's 5,000,000, 50 million packages a day. Should check that number, but I know it starts with 5. So it's already huge. But Cainiao does have competition, for example, from JD Logistics, which also spun off from JD and also raised a few $1 billion in funding. So I think it does have competition. For that business, I think the technology will be really, really important, right? Because logistics is going to be very much, in the future at least, it's going to be very much reliant on machines, algorithms, data to be the most efficient in the business. So we'll see if they're able to sort of hold on to that commanding, leading position that they have now.
And of course, not just JD Logistics, also Shunfeng, which is almost the equivalent of a DHL in China as well.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of competition.
So how about smart retail then? This whole online and offline concept, because now both Alibaba and Tencent are heading into this retail space and it's getting very hot there as well.
Yeah, my personal opinion is that it's a little overblown at this point. So I went to Rui Ma's supermarket, which is their sort of like smart grocery store, like I said earlier, at the beginning of the year. And I don't know, maybe I was one of the few people who was unimpressed, but I was really unimpressed. And I think while there is opportunity in sort of completely cashierless completely automated stores, convenience stores. I'm not sure if that is going to be as easy to roll out or as profitable as maybe some of the other businesses like Aliyun or whatever that Alibaba is working on. So we'll see, right? Again, because I think the real competition is not like people staffed stores. The real competition is like really easy delivery. So I'm not really sure the smart retail space is going to be, as big as people think. Not the offline portion anyway. The smart retail that we're talking about is like offline grocery stores and convenience stores, right? I think people like over invested into it in China in particular at the end of last year. There were just like so many companies that got funded in this space, and you're already starting to see some of them die.
So what does it mean for the competitors for Alibaba? For example, BAT, there's still Baidu and Tencent, and of course the rest of the Chinese tech giants, and I should mention the TMD, Toutiao, Meituan, Dianping, and Didi. What does it mean for them? And of course Jingdong as well, which is lurking from the sidelines. They are biggest competitor in e-commerce.
You mean because Jack Ma retired?
Yeah, as in this leadership transition, what does it mean also for the competition that they are facing as a group? Because in China, it's very competitive.
Well, like I said, honestly, Jack still will continue to be involved, right? So although he is abdicating his chairman role next year, he will continue to be on the board, and he will be on this sort of lifetime partnership board of 36 people who still exert significant, control. I think that for the competitors in China, the other internet companies, in the Chinese media, what we've seen is that Jack's move has been sort of greatly applauded. And in fact, a lot of people said, hey, teacher Jack Ma, this might be his greatest lesson yet, how to sort of let go and let the company grow without him overshadowing it. And there in it implicitly is a challenge for the other internet companies to see what they will do, if they will come up with a succession plan. I think especially with some of the recent scandals that come up, with JD, with DD, there is increasing sort of scrutiny of corporate governance, especially for publicly listed companies like JD. And maybe that will have some pressure for, the peers of Alibaba. Maybe some shareholders will come up and be like, hey, we actually want to know if there is a succession plan. We want to know if, who's next in line. And also, hey, there are all these corporate governance things that maybe don't make the most sense. But I don't know. I don't know if people will really be that vocal about it. Because again, Chinese internet companies are still growing so fast. Like even Alibaba, it's still growing 61% year on year. That's crazy. So I don't know if shareholders would just be distracted by the growth and not focus on this because, when things are going really well, when the car is going really fast, you don't want to change drivers in the middle, right? So we'll see.
Rui Ma, many thanks for coming on the show and talk about your thoughts on Alibaba's leadership transition. And of course, in closing, I would like to ask you two questions. My first question is, can you recommend a book, movie, podcast, or anything that has impacted your personal or work life?
Yeah, first of all, I love your podcast, and I don't listen to that many podcasts actually, despite being a podcaster. So I do love. I would love to recommend Revisionist History, which probably a lot of people have listened to, but it's Malcolm Gladwell's podcast. Haven't had the chance to read too many books lately, but I did finally see the movie 3 Billboards Out of Ebbing, Missouri. And that was an amazing movie. I really highly recommend everyone see it. But it could be too American for maybe your audience. But I think it just captures so well a lot of it's just well acted, well scripted, and it captures so well a lot of the current status quo in America. Really interesting.
So where can my audience find you then?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter these days. RUIMA is my Twitter handle. And then, I think that's probably where I'm mostly at because I'm not very active on the other social networks anymore. And of course, subscribe to our podcast.
Yeah, highly recommended. I'm also listening to it. It's now on my feed too on Overcast.
Oh, thank you so much.
TechBuzz China. You can definitely Google me at Bernard Leong, and you can find the podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Acast, or anywhere else in the world. And of course, tweet to me, give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. Seriously, that helps in my discovery. And I'm sure Raymond will say the same for her podcast too.
Yep.
And give us a star on Overcast and Pocket Cast. And of course, most importantly, I always would love feedback. And it would be great. And Rui Ma, once again, many thanks for coming on the show, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Thank you so much.